Okay, I think I see we have almost 70 people logged on. I'm glad to see so many people interested in our topic today, which is, of course, equality and the role of education policies. We're going to have a sort of round table where our speakers, we've got excellent speakers today, are going to talk about what they've been working on, and then we will have a Q&A session. I hope everyone today is familiar with Zoom, as of course we all are in this new world in 2020. My name is Jennifer Baker. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm not supposed to be an expert on the topic. My main role is to try and get the most out of our speakers and to put your questions to them. So with that, let me give a little brief introduction. I'm sure many of us are, as I say, familiar with Zoom, but if you see at the bottom of your screen, there are a few different options for you. You can use the chat function, but that's kind of a private function. What I really want is to see people using the Q&A. That's the bottom of your screen on the far right. You can use that to type in questions while our speakers are speaking if something piques your interest and you want to hear a little bit more about it, or if you simply want to ask something that's relevant to the topic in general, and I will try to put that to our speakers. We're going to speak for we have about an hour and a few minutes this morning, because I'm aware of the fact that I've let people join a little bit late. But with that, let me introduce you to our three speakers. First of all, we have Sara Baiocco, who is a researcher in jobs and skills at CEPS. She has a background in development economics and a PhD in computerization and labour in India and an MSc in local economic developments from LSE. Larissa Zierow is a postdoctoral researcher at the IFO Institute and University of Munich, and also Deputy Director of Education, and she is part of the InChild Research Group. And then last but not least, Arnaud Lefranc is Professor of Economics at Cergy Paris Université. His research focuses on intergenerational mobility of opportunity and the role of family background in shaping individual and economic success. Now, I'm going to start off with Sara. Each of our speakers is going to have a bit of time just to set out what they've been working on, and then we'll go to general questions. Feel free to ask questions via the Q&A function while they're speaking if something is interesting you, and we will circle back and touch on all the important points that are going to be raised today. With that, Sara, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Jennifer, for inviting me and introducing me. Thanks to our audience for listening. So let me start by saying that the speed of transformations that we live today, as well as the uncertainty of the outcomes of this transformation, which has, of course, increased with the COVID-19 situation, require people to keep learning throughout their life, to adapt to the changes that they experience in the way they interact in the society during their life, and importantly in their jobs, in the tasks they have performed, and then their possible changes in their career. Therefore, the skills acquired earlier in life during initial education, even if the most updated ones, may not be sufficient to continue participating fully and actively in a changing society and to stay employable in the future. As a result, the key role for policy makers is, first of all, to adapt to the education and training systems to this changed path of learning. And for this, there are mainly probably two layers of intervention required. One is to concentrate on the initial education, so on schools, university, and also on early childhood education, which is increasingly important to provide people with the bulk of basic skills, cognitive, but also not cognitive skills, which are increasingly important to adapt to change and to deal with uncertainty, and also basic digital skills to keep the pace of digitalization. And this would enhance the individual's capacity to keep learning later in life. Then the second layer is for sure enhancing the adult learning systems, which are traditionally the weakest part of our education and training system in terms, for example, of public investment. And this is to meet the increased demand for up and reskilling of adults, of those that are already in the labor market, and to deliver opportunity to learn, as I said, later in life. I focus on this latter because adult learning has indeed a strong potential to increase equality of opportunity for adults, so later in life, This because adult learning can complement the skills that are acquired in initial education and can make sure that people stay employable despite shrinking sectors or obsolescence of tasks and jobs. And adult learning can also lower in general the differences that adults experience in employment rates and earning capacity, because these differences depend on educational levels and educational levels, which are in turn rooted into children's socioeconomic backgrounds and conditions of learning early in life, as probably Larissa and Arnaud will detail later on. Now, indeed, one of the most important initiatives of the European Commission in the field of skills development in the last years, the recommendation for upskilling pathways, comes with the motto, new opportunities for adults, precisely to highlight the fact that adult learning can deliver new opportunities for learning later in life. Now, in reality, however, adult learning is far from being unequal, is far from being unequal opportunities available to everyone, because access to adult learning itself relies on previous experiences in life, in education and in employment. So let me give just a few numbers. For example, the adult participation rate, considering participation in learning in the last 12 months, is 13% for the entire adult population in the EU, but it is only 18% for those that are low qualified and only 11% for those that are unemployment. Adult learning participation rates are also significantly lower for those that are in non-standard forms of employment, in temporary work, and are also lower for women due to work-life balance considerations, but also because women tend to be overrepresented in these categories of employment that I mentioned earlier. So adult learning has indeed a strong potential to equalize opportunities later in life, during adulthood, but at the state of play, actually, it remains rather unequal in itself, and thus it may fail to have this equalizer effect. Thus, it would be necessary to strengthen adult learning overall, but also to make access to it more equal through actions that target those groups that are more vulnerable and more disadvantaged in accessing adult learning. Now, thanks to the attention that is drawn on upper skilling due to digitalization, transition to climate neutral economy and so on, there have been interesting policy developments in the field of adult learning in the last decades. At the European level, for example, the European Pillar of Social Rights has established the right to adult learning, because in the first principle, the pillar says that everyone in the European Union has the right to quality lifelong learning, so including adult learning opportunities. Then, as I mentioned already earlier, already in 2016, the recommendation for upskilling pathways was adopted and asked member states to put in place policy measures to ensure access to adult learning of low qualified people, to make sure that they can acquire basic skills even if they already left initial education. And then finally, the most recent development at the European level, in July, the European Commission has adopted the European Skills Agenda, which has 12 lines of action to foster adult learning and skills development in the EU. And this includes also a possible initiative on individual learning accounts to guarantee the right to access adult learning at on individual basis. At member state level, now focusing on support to individuals rather than to firms and so on to upgrade skills. A recent mapping we have done for the European Commission of existing individual-based instrument to support access to adult learning has evidence that actually these instruments are already in place in all European countries. Then, of course, the level of developments of these instruments differ. Probably the most developed one towards a universal right to adult learning is the Compte de Formation Professionnelle in France. Also, this mapping has highlighted that despite the measures are actually in place in all member states, the take-up of the benefits and the incentives to access adult learning varies considerably and is dependent upon the framework conditions of the adult learning systems. For example, especially for low qualified, the financial incentives and benefits are not often sufficient to foster their participation in adult learning, and instead some additional services like guidance or counseling services for these people have an important role to actually make them access the policy benefit and also participate in learning and determine positive outcomes. Now, to conclude, considering this brief overview, I would like to remark that in the next few years, thanks to raising policy awareness about the need to continue learning throughout the lifespan, and also possibly thanks also to the EU funds for the recovery, which in some cases are also dedicated to skills-related investment, adult learning systems can actually flourish and be enhanced in the next years, and policy measures can be developed to deliver actually equal opportunity to all adults.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to come back. There's a lot of ideas there that you've piqued that I've been writing down notes. I want to come back to questions on computerization and in particular the COVID crisis as well. Now, Arnaud and Larissa, I know you're both going to talk about your experience in working with InChat, but Larissa, I'm going to hand over to you first to give us your thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much. I will share some slides.
Yes, that's great. I think we can all see that now. So
okay, perfect. Yeah. So I start. Thank you very much for having me and for organizing this lunch debate. So our project team investigated the impact of the COVID-19 related school closures on educational inequality. And as in almost all countries and also almost all other European countries, schools were closed for a long time in Germany. So from mid-March to mid of June, there was no normal in-classroom teaching. And I will talk about some of the evidence, what that meant for education and educational inequality. So we look at this setting of 3 months of nationwide school closures, and the setting in Germany is a setting where there is almost no digital learning infrastructure. In fact, Germany is has the last rank when you compare the European school systems in terms of digital learning infrastructure. And there was also no master plan of school ministries how to deal with a long period of school closures and how things should work in such a situation. We ran a survey in June with over 1,000 parents of school-age children, and we gathered information on educational inputs such as learning time, but also time spent on creative activities, but also like rather passive activities as watching TV before and during the school closures. And what we do is that we focus on the gaps between children with academic versus non-academic family background, but we also investigate inequality with respect to student achievement and gender. So just to give you a short preview, we see that school-related and learning activities decreased by a half for all of the students during the school closures. And we see that time that was before the school closure spent on learning activities, that this time was substituted by time spent on rather passive activities. And in terms of inequality, we see that non-academic family background students received less support by their schools during the time of school closures. And I will now just show you some of the results in more detail. So here you see the time use of students before and during the corona-related school closures. And here we have the group of children with non-academic family background, and below children with academic family background. And we see here that before corona, both groups spent more than 7 hours a day on school-related activities, so being in school and learning at home. And for both groups, there's a drastic decrease in this in the time spent on these activities. So both groups reduced time spent on learning and school-related activities by more than half. So they only spent like 3.5 hours a day on learning time. And so this is the same for both groups. When we now look at what kind of activities replaced these learning activities, we see that in terms of reading, creative activities like playing music and doing then physical activities like doing sports, that this remained rather the same before during Corona. So there's a small increase for both groups of students. But when it comes to doing rather passive activities, watching TV, playing games on the PC or mobile phone, we see that children with non-academic family background increased the time spent on these activities by more than 1 hour. So in the end, on average, they spend 5.5 an hour per day on these activities. So they spent like 2 hours more on those activities than they spent on actual learning. When we compare this with a group of children with academic family background, we also see here an increase of more than 1 hour a day for these children. But in the end, because before the school closures, they already did less of these activities, then they spent 1 hour less on these rather passive activities. But the increase is also large. So when it comes to the support of schools and the activities of schools during the school closures, we see here in Germany that there was very few online teaching going on. So in the group of the children with non-academic family background, only 4% of children did online classes on a daily basis. And almost half of those students never had any online classroom teaching going on. This number is a bit smaller for the group of children with academic family background, but it's also high, so it's larger than 1/3. Those children never had any online teaching for the whole class going on. And we also see that individual contact, so like phone calls with teachers, which would have been possible also without using computers and having a lot of digital knowledge. Also, this did not take place very often. So in the group of children with non-academic family background, also half of the children never had any individual contact with their teacher. And this is much larger than the group of children with academic family background. And we also asked what kind of other things they did during the time. And the task that they had to do most often was to complete exercise sheets. And almost everyone got exercise sheets that they had to work on. Interestingly, and maybe sadly, there is a large group of students who got very few feedback on these tasks. And this number is also larger in the group of children with non-academic family background. So 19% of children with non-academic parents never got any feedback on the exercises they worked on during the school closures. So let me conclude, and I'm happy to discuss other findings later in the discussion round. So here in our survey, we find that time spent on learning activities decreased by half during the school closures. Learning activities were substituted by rather passive activities. And we see that non-academic family background students received less support by their schools than academic background students did. So overall, our results indicate that it's very likely that educational inequality will increase due to the COVID-19 related school closures. So thank you very much. I stop the presentation.
Thank you very much. That has actually provoked a few questions. I'm going to come back to them. There's specific questions related to the methodology of your study, but I think it might be interesting to sort of broaden those out to all the panelists after we hear from Arnaud. I'm going to hand over the floor to you now.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thanks to CEPS and EconPol for inviting me to this roundtable. I would like to share some general comments on the topic of the role of educational policy in addressing equality of opportunity. And to start, I would like to quote Horace Mann, who was an early American advocate of public education, who said, quote unquote, "Education beyond all other devices of human origin is the great equalizer of the conditions of man and the balance wheel of the social machinery." And although this view was formulated a long time ago in the middle of the 19th century, I think it still captures the prevalent idea that nowadays educational policies is one of the best tools to secure equality of opportunity in life. And this being said, and more than a century and a half after this quote, we still live in a world with considerable inequality in life chances, where family background remains a major determinant of educational success, of economic outcomes. It's known to everyone, of course, in the audience, that on average in the OECD, about 15% of differences in success at school can be rooted in the family background of kids. And just here to clarify my take on equality of opportunity, my focus will be on this link between family background and later success. Of course, there's plenty of other dimensions that shape inequality of opportunity, such as gender issues or other things related to adult education, as discussed by Sara. But my focus will rather be the effect of social origin and family background. And in my intervention, what I would like to do is to draw on my past research on equality of opportunity and intergenerational mobility and education to highlight some general difficulties and questions that need to be addressed if we want to think about whether and how educational policy can foster equality of opportunity. So I would like briefly to start commenting on the evidence and the lack thereof. We still miss a lot of evidence on the role of existing policy to curb the influence of family background. There's a lack of data, there's a lack of clean evidence, due to the fact, in particular, that the context in which major educational policy reforms, major options in terms of shaping the educational systems in different countries, well, these differences across countries are implemented often in a way that prevents a clear evaluation of their effects. So we have a common sense that this country is performing better than that other country, but to pinpoint the effect of particular policy designs in contributing to inequality of opportunity is a much more difficult exercise, and there's still a lot that empirical research need to bring here. Also related to that is the fact that we often lack the relevant tools to precisely nail down the extent of equality of opportunity. We often use coarse tools when we would need fine-grained instruments. For instance, many studies, and I contribute to them, compare the average outcome of, say, lower SES versus upper socioeconomic background kids, while for a large part, the advantage or disadvantage is concentrated among specific subgroups of this population. That's also an important limitation, which I will get back to when discussing who the educational policy should target to foster education, equality of opportunity. This being said, there's still some evidence that educational policies play a role for alleviating inequality of opportunity, and the main conclusion is that the effect of educational policy is significant but might be limited. So here I'm going to draw on various papers that have contributed to on this topic. First, a series of papers on the effect of preschool enrollment. So that's a usual suspect for devising educational policies leveling the playing field. It's early intervention. So with a bunch of co-authors, we've looked at the effect of the implementation of universal preschool programs in two countries, in France and in Norway. And we found that indeed such early intervention where kids are enrolled very early in their life in school, so somehow away from their family background, tends to partly level the playing field. We have some significant effect. For instance, in France, we find that 1/3 of the gap between lower and upper social groups in success in primary school is reduced by early enrollment in school. And beyond primary school, there's some sign of persistence. Even in adult life, for instance, it reduces by 10% the income gap between kids from different social backgrounds. We find similar results in Norway, where a large-scale universal preschool program had the effect of reducing inequality of opportunity by about 10%. We've also, with a bunch of co-authors, we've also conducted similar assessments for later policy reforms, such as reforms increasing the age of the compulsory age of schooling. The evidence from various contexts, again in France and Sweden, suggests that this forcing people into school for a longer time improves the economic prospect of disadvantaged kids vis-a-vis more privileged ones, although by a smaller extent. And I'm going to try to draw some conclusions and highlight some questions raised by this series of results on the effect of educational policy in preschool, educational policy later on in life. The first comment is about the fact that the effects of these different policies are present but remain limited. And they are limited also in the light that what we're talking about here are large-scale programs that are quite costly for public finance. And so the first question this opens is whether universal schooling policies or universal schooling reforms are the best way of advancing the prospects and the outcomes of the most disadvantaged children, or whether educational policy should take the form of more targeted programs. This being said, it's also important to highlight the various limitations that targeted programs raise. The first one is the stigmatization, the possible stigmatization of children enrolled in this program. The second fact is that there might be some negative spillover effect of these targeted policy increasing or improving the school environment of disadvantaged kids, and that the negative spillovers are related to the stigma effect, and implementation of such targeted policies could change parental decisions, the school composition in terms of in terms of recruitment of a variety of student profiles in schools with negative effect. And also related to these targeted policies is attached a fairness issue. By focusing resources on disadvantaged children, these targeted policy may be seen as hurting the development prospects of better off children, which would raise issues of political support for these reforms. The second thing that the sort of the half empty, half full glass, or the mixed results and the score is, of course, the remaining role of family investment. Family inputs matter. They matter as input in the learning process, as in the slides that Larissa showed. There's a significant share of time that is spent studying at home with parental help. Not only family investment is important for as an input in the learning process, but it's also important in shaping the aspirations of children that are important determinants of their adult outcomes. And so one question here is how educational policy can compensate this important dimension of the home environment that is a major challenge. Educational policy can first act on what's taking place in school, but a lot is taking place out of school. Although educational policy can help in this way, and I have in mind there was a recent reform here in France called Homework Done. The Homework Done program was meant to help kids with their homework after school time, but still in school, supervised by some teachers. But by emphasizing the role of family investment, I also want to highlight another important dimension, which is the interplay between inequality of family conditions and inequality of opportunity, and to emphasize the fact that it's not only educational policy that should be responsible for securing equality of opportunity. A policy aimed at equalizing the conditions of adults might improve the home environment of kids and their learning process and the equality of their life chances. For instance, the difference in time spent online or following online courses in Larissa's result could eventually be related to the availability of enough computer equipment at home, and this could also be related to differences in poverty rate or economic conditions across parents. The last message to emphasize and to highlight here with regard to how educational policy can alleviate inequality of opportunity is about the timing of policy interventions. When we look at early intervention, we tend to find larger effects than later throughout school curricula. That's an important element to keep in mind. That's also an important research question to dig a little bit further. And that's also one of the key areas of research of the in-child research project that both Larissa and I are in.
Thank you, Arnaud. Now, we have several questions come in, mostly actually directed at Larissa, probably because everyone's looking at your figures and asking questions about them. But let me first ask this one to you, Arnaud, since you've been speaking. It's how do you define non-academic and academic family background? I'm going to come to Larissa to ask how you specifically define it for your research. But Arnaud, perhaps you would answer that question in whether there's a specific set of criteria you look at.
I'll let Larissa give the details because I'm not using this distinction. It's probably a way of sort of splitting the entire population of children according to their family educational background, but maybe Larissa will clarify. But that's more generally related to the coarseness of the tools that we use to define what are the possibly disadvantaged or advantaged groups. We have a continuum of socioeconomic conditions and socioeconomic stages, and among that, well, we cut some big slices on that scale, but it often does not allow us to precisely go at the most disadvantaged of the disadvantaged.
Okay, Larissa, since this question was specifically directed to you in relation to your research, how do you define non-academic and academic family background for the purposes of your research?
Yeah, in our project, we defined a family with academic background as one where at least one parent has an academic degree. And this is often done in such kind of research. We also did a split by parental income, and there are different dimensions. So in some, such as Arnaud said, it's we want to proxy somehow the home environment, maybe the ability of parents to help with homework, but also, of course, parental income and resources that could be helpful for the child. And so that's the proxy that we use. But there are also other inequality dimensions. So in this COVID-19 crisis, I think it's also very interesting to look at the differences by student achievement, because what was really happening was that students did not have any more a teacher explaining tasks, but just getting these worksheets to read something and to somehow understand what they should do. And we think that especially low achieving students, students who usually also struggle in school, maybe had especially problems with that. And so we also find large differences in learning time and things like by this dimension. So there are different possibilities, but academic background is one dimension which is often looked at in terms of equality of opportunity.
We also have a question specifically related again to your research from Laurent, who's asking whether it was possible to isolate the results for pupils with migrant backgrounds, and what sort of granularity was possible.
Due to the sample size, that was not possible. It would be very interesting to have some results on that. I'm looking forward to research which has more data on that. Yeah.
Okay, and then Larissa, sorry, last question to grill you, because we have a few questions via Q&A and chat, asking whether or not this research is publicly available. I'm sure we can, with the organisers of this event, share your slides at least, but is there somewhere that we can share with people that they can fully look at the research?
Yeah, at the moment we only have a German version of it, but we are working on an English version as well. So I can share the German version, of course, on the platform, and then just provide information as soon as we have the English version as well.
Okay, thank you very much. We will, as I say, together with the organisers of today's lunchtime debate, try and get those details sent to people, because I think there's a lot of interest. Sara, I want to bring you back in, because we've talked a bit about equality of opportunity. Whereas you use the phrase earning capacity, where do you see the sort of the cross section between what you're looking at and what Arnaud and Larissa have been talking about?
Yes, basically what I meant about the equalizing effect that adult learning can have, it's precisely to correct for these inequalities that pile up during the life course, that starts really in schools for children, given the family background, as Arnaud pointed out, and also the research by Larissa highlights very well. So basic adult learning can modify by complementing this once the people are already in the labor market. And also when Arnaud was mentioning the fact, if I understood correctly, that educational policy are necessary but might not be sufficient to actually deliver equality of opportunities, because there is a need of a holistic approach to the problem, and also intervening beyond education. For example, with the family benefits that can help families in taking care of children earlier in their life, but also later on with active labor market policies and social inclusion policies that can relieve parents and can equalize a bit the possibility of parents, and also work-life balance policies that can give parents the possibility to deliver more attention to their children, which which I believe makes some difference here.
I'm going to come back to you, but I mean, Gisela de Vries has also asked a question about the inequalities identified. Now, I know this is going to be for more Arnaud and Larissa, but Do you see different resources of schools and the abilities of teachers as having a central effect on the outcomes for even for an adult learning stage?
Pardon, I didn't get this one.
What is the impact of the resources of schools and the abilities of teachers on the outcome of learning yet at adult stage?
Well, of course, it's very important. Indeed, the adult learning policies can also focus on the supply of education and training, so enhancing the education and training system from the supply side. So rather than giving incentives, financial incentives to individuals, adult learning policies can enhance education and training, for example, giving more resources to schools for adults and to give resources to upgrade the skills of teachers to teach to adults, which is of course different from teaching to students. And yes, it has significant importance, and it's also why adult learning policies have to insist on both on the demand side and the supply side. Also, regarding adult learning, digitalization is also significantly important, and also this, upgrading the competencies of teachers to adults in a digital way is important.
I think we're going to come back to that specifically in relation to the COVID crisis. Arnaud, the same question to you. I mean, what is the impact of the resources of schools and the specific abilities of teachers?
It's a very good question. It is indeed true that teachers' ability shape the learning outcomes of their students, and that's an interesting avenue, although a touchy one, for educational policy and for educational reforms, which is to act on the allocation mechanisms that assigns teachers with different ability, different level of experience to schools with more or less advantaged children. It is not often something that is sort of overtly discussed, but through various promotion mechanisms, it tends to be the case that more experienced and better teachers tend to also concentrate in sort of more privileged learning environments. So one key issue here is to provide the incentives through appropriate allocation mechanisms for teachers to be assigned to the schools where their contribution or their specific efficiency at enhancing the learning of their kids is directed to disadvantaged schools and environments.
Larissa, I'm going to put that same question to you, but I'm also going to tie in a question we have here from Michael Teutsch, which is also about the preparedness of teachers for distance learning, and specifically in the sort of COVID pandemic times that we're living in. How does that impact? So it's resources and it's also teachers' preparedness is the question to you, Larissa.
Yeah, so I agree with the others. So the literature shows that having a good teacher is like the most important input in the educational production function. And so the question whether more privileged children also get better teachers of higher ability, I think that often happens. We cannot show this in our survey, but we just see that those children from academic backgrounds, they have more often a teacher providing online classes, reaching out to the students and giving feedback. So that somehow shows that they are maybe more motivated. Maybe they also get more pressure of the parents. So, but I think that, this can of course increase inequalities if less motivated, lower ability teachers sort into lower income areas and so on. And so we also ask in our survey and we not only ask parents, but like a representative group of the German population whether they think that teachers should be obliged to do like training for digital teaching, whether they should be obliged to teach online during school closures, and whether they should be obliged to have like individual contact with students, and there are large majorities in favor of that. So more than 80% of the German population think that teachers should be obliged to do that, which would be like a very strong policy measure. But it would be in favor, and I think this is something how to tackle, maybe decrease also some of these inequalities if you can otherwise not motivate everyone to do training in these dimensions. And,
yeah, I mean, we've got a couple of questions again from Laurence saying that there's unequal access to internet and access to, I mean, these digital tools, they're only as useful as those who are able to use them. If you don't have access to the internet, which is, I mean, it still exists in various strands of European society, despite, you know, the efforts of you know, those of us here in Brussels who hear about every European digital. How, given the current COVID pandemic, is there a push for these other policy areas to come in and provide access? Because, you know, if children don't have online facilities, they can't possibly access online learning. Larissa, I'm sort of directing that at you, but Arnaud, perhaps you can come in with this idea of other policy areas that are needed to back up the efforts from an educational point of view.
Yeah, this is indeed an important, a way to compensate for lack of family resources in a crucial dimension of the learning process, and a dimension that the digital dimension, which is going to become increasingly important. And there are actually some policy measures taken in this direction. In the French case, it's more and more the case that at the regional level, there's a policy to equip pupils with computer equipment. What is the exact effect of this policy is an open question, and whether this is the appropriate way of securing equality of opportunity to provide every kid with a computer financed out of public resources is also an important question, because some kids already have access to proper digital equipment. So you might think that the effort should be targeted at kids without the relevant tools. But this is indeed not only an interesting option, but this is an avenue that is taken in existing policies.
Sarah, let me ask you about digitalization. Do you see it as there's talks about barriers to entry to some levels of education, but surely digitalization is also a huge opportunity for increased learning?
Yes, indeed, it is so, and I think that the COVID-19 situation and the lockdown highlighted very well the potential for digital learning, as well at the same time as Larissa showed very well. I mean, it's far from being straightforward. There are still many difficulties to be overcome. We did a study even before the COVID-19 assessing the readiness of EU countries to shift to digital learning or to blended learning, and actually Germany ranked as the last one, as Larissa. I mean, this is also consistent with what Larissa said. So the potential is there. The conditions to make so that the outcome are equal are far from being reached at the moment, both at country level. So there is a significant difference at country level, within countries, from region to region, and also at individual level, because first of all, we have to ensure that everyone has the digital skills to access digital learning, but also not only investments in technology and infrastructure are needed, and these are far from being equal across the entire European Union, but also investment in competencies to teachers to adapt to this new learning process, and to make sure that the responsibility does not fall entirely on the family or on the children, even less on the children himself. And the same applies more or less to adult learning. So yes, the benefits are there, and for adult learning there is even an additional benefit. So one of the main barrier to adult learning is time constraints or financial constraints. Now, digital learning provides great flexibility and can be delivered at lower cost. So for adult learning, the potential is even higher. But again, if the adults don't have the digital skills, or we don't ensure that the quality of the supply of digital learning is not let's say ensured, then the outcomes are not there.
Larissa, there's a specific question related to your research about whether or not you asked questions about the parents' level of digital skills or competency in terms of getting involved with their kids' online learning. Was that part of your research or not?
No, I'm sorry. We did not ask about the parents' skill. Would have been interesting though, yeah.
I think it would. As I say, lots of questions coming in about the specific nature of your research. We're definitely going to try and share that with the attendees and the participants after our debate today. However, I mean, you talked a lot about this passive idea, so being on your laptop or being on your phone. I mean, is there a prejudice there that we think that just because computer games are games that they're not a learning background? Because obviously many of those that I talk to in the gaming community and so on would say that actually they are opportunities for learning. Larissa, do you want to tackle that question?
Yeah, so I think that as regards scientific knowledge about that, there's mixed evidence. I think researchers agree that up to a certain amount of time, you can also benefit in terms of skill development when you play some computer games. But if it's up to 5 hours, 6 hours a day, as we see in our study, I think it's people would agree that it's probably not skill enhancing anymore, especially when you compare to doing stuff for school and completing tasks of the school curriculum. So and we also ask parents about their perceptions of how good these different dimensions of activities are for their child's development, and they're rather, they somehow agree with what we said. So almost all parents think that reading and playing music, doing sports is somehow good for their children, and being in school is good for their children and their children's skills. And playing computer, watching TV, there's the majority of parents, independent of their own education and so on, they all think it's not so good for the skill development.
Okay, that's sort of feeding into one of the questions that is from Simon Hiotto. I saved it sort of for the last question because it's kind of a very overarching, which is that in defining equality of opportunity, how do you correct for personal preference, educational attainment, activity in the labour market, without imposing so-called middle-class goals? So children of parents of less educational attainment have lower educational goals. Should we accept their choices or their aspirations, or should we try to change their aspirations? That's a big question. As I say, I know I'm going to direct it to you because I've left it for last. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I'd like to hear your thoughts and reaction to that question. And Sara, I'm going to pass on to you afterwards with in relation to another question we've had.
It's a difficult question to answer, both in principle and in practice. In practice, for the sheer reason that we have very few tools to assess these aspirations, although we know that they are playing an important role in the background and in developing the motivation of the children, in shaping their choice of track and career. Now, one key difficulty here is that even if we could measure those aspirations, those preferences, it would still be possible that those what appears as a choice could in fact be a constrained choice, shaped and reflecting an internalized view on limited opportunity or less promising opportunities than other children. To be very honest, there's no clear-cut answer to that question. But I would be rather skeptical about an explanation of the differences in results between kids from different backgrounds, emphasizing the fact that this is a choice. I tend to believe that there still is a large degree of constraints in the differences in outcome, reflecting lesser opportunities for disadvantaged kids.
Thank you. So Sara, the same question to you about the questions of aspirations, but I'm going to tie it into a question we have from Mantas, who says, how do we overcome one of the main barriers to adult learning, which is the lack of individual motivation? So perhaps as your final response, you could address the questions of aspiration and motivation.
Yeah, which is indeed one of the most difficult. I agree with Arnaud, there is no straightforward answers, but I agree on the fact that often behind preference, individual preferences, aspirations, motivation, whatever we want to call it, there are other factors that are indeed related to the societal background and the institutional background we live in. So while it's rather hard to act on individuals' preferences, perhaps the role of policies is to act on these factors that influences the preferences and motivations and inspirations. Regarding aspirations, regarding specifically individual learning accounts and lack of motivation, again, behind lack of motivation, it's possible that there are the wrong incentive mechanisms. For example, individuals sometimes are not sure they will have a return of their investment in skills if these skills are not made visible through qualification or certification. So, for example, assigning already for sure the tracking and the tracking of skills that are acquired through adult learning could help in making people realize the benefits, like the direct benefits of their adult learning participation. And also, as I referred earlier, probably guidance and counseling can help in let's say, streamline their efforts in adult learning, also recognizing the skills that they have acquired during their work life, because often learning is also a process of recognition of what is already learned. So it could indeed help to continue in a path of learning.
Thank you. I'm going to leave the final word now, Larissa, is a question from Andrea, which is, what is the role of full-time education in compensating the role of family educational background for children, which I think is central to your research and actually central to our topic today, which is about educational policy. So we've been talking for an hour, and of course we're never going to be able to sum things up, but Larissa, if you could just briefly respond to that question, the role of full-time education in compensating for the role of family educational background.
Yeah, family background is still very important, but I think a good educational system can indeed really reduce or have a big role in decreasing inequalities which are arising from different family backgrounds. And yeah, but that depends on the quality of the education system, on the tracking, on early childhood education happening before children entering school, so kind of leveling the playing field. And so a good mix of these public institutions can, as a lot of research and also our research show, help to decrease inequalities induced by different family backgrounds. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've tried to cover as many of the questions that have been coming in. A lot of the questions, of course, Larissa, are related to your research. So we're going to try and get those out to people after this debate. We'll send out the emails. Of course, as I hope everyone who is tuned in today knows, this is a series of debates. So please keep an eye out for the CEPS EconPol future debates. We're going to talk about some more interesting topics coming up in the weeks and months, and of course, very much in the context of the coronavirus that sort of pandemic that has changed the way we live, changed the way we work, but obviously also changed the way we educate. Thank you very much. Thank you to all our speakers. Once again, I think we've had an interesting topic. I'm aware we didn't get to everyone's questions, but we will try to continue this debate online through social media. I'm sure everyone can find you all online through the emails that we've been sending out. And with that, I hope everyone has a very good afternoon, and this has been a useful and instructive way to spend your lunch hour.